So we're here in Zurich at the Evolving Caravan conference, organised by a collective of entrepreneurs and tech enthusiasts who have been travelling around Europe, delivering conferences at the major cities. And we just came from the World Economic Forum in Davos, and I'm here with Bernt Wahl, who was a professor at UC Berkeley on engineering and entrepreneurship. Now, would you like to add maybe a bit more to your background?
Well, we started computers really early. I was Apple I, and because of that, I got to be involved with these mathematicians who were developing chaos theory and fractal geometry, and I got to be the kid, and the rest is history. And the thing I was interested in at Davos, I basically came here for blockchain, but I also have an interest in brain-machine interface. And at this conference here, we were talking a lot about how the mind interacts with the body, which interacts with a lot of dimensions of how people interact with the world. So that's basically my background. I have way too many institutions I was involved with. I did big data, a lot of early fields of in the Silicon Valley. I got to know a lot of the people who pioneered a lot of companies. 3 of my friends started search engines. I tried to take over one called InfoSeek. And so that was kind of the environment I grew up in. And so for me, starting companies and trying to build technologies is a natural way of manifesting your personality and what you try to do.
And your focus in more recent years seems to have transferred from lecturing at Berkeley to your students then asking for your expertise as being an advisor on their tech startups.
Yeah, so we were very successful. So John Berkstone started a program called CET outside of the business school, and then I took over his class when he was out running bigger companies, and we just built it. So in the business school, they spend time writing a business plan, raising money to do what? Hire engineers. In engineering, we just build it, find the problem, find the solution, find the customer, and iterate. And that kind of became the Berkeley method. And this last year, we started more companies than any other university in the world. Now, Stanford generated more money for their companies, but we literally started more companies.
Now, you're quite involved in artificial intelligence, and we had a discussion the other day over breakfast before Trump landed that I am in the school of thought that computers will never attain a level of consciousness that we as humans experience.
Well, it's in some respects it doesn't matter. And I've heard this over and over, it's not an original quote. So Peter Norvig kind of wrote one of the pioneering textbooks on artificial intelligence. He was at Berkeley, he's now the director at Google. And for a long time, artificial intelligence and all these things weren't making a lot of headway. Initially, a lot of these ideas, it's like, wow, this is exciting, we're going to do this. And they kind of tapered off a little bit. And it wasn't until the amount of data that you got from companies like Google and Yahoo and other ones that you could process huge amounts of information of how people thought and all the nuances. The great strides in artificial intelligence have been made. And it's often said that more data is worth more than better algorithms. And in some cases, that's the truth. If you want to combine them both, you can probably optimize. But the amount of data that you have access to today is on a scale we never even thought of years ago. And it's letting us do things in ways that we never thought possible. One example is language translations. They now have devices that you can put in your ear and then you can translate language and a synthesis of text. So, Turing test, how you can tell the difference between talking to a human being and a computer? The computer won't make mistakes. And one of the things I said at the CIO conference a few months ago, I said, we have the search engine and we're getting all the information from all over the world, we're scraping it, and we're trying to create the knowledge engine where we know what is pristine data, accurate data versus inaccurate data. But what we really need to create is the knowledge engine. It is the wisdom engine. So it takes that data that's pristine and makes intelligent decisions on it that we can basically say we can eradicate this or we can optimize this. And that's what we're really striving for. And AI is kind of that wisdom engine.
With the advent of quantum computing, what might we possibly see as major paradigm shifts? For example, we had a discussion the other day where we discussed blockchain and how it relies on prime number encryption, and a quantum computer would be able to crack that almost instantly.
Yeah, so quantum computing is an interesting, it's almost a dilemma. And a lot of countries are putting a lot of resources and in that particular technology, because then we can decrypt all the emails and everything that we thought were safe for at least 20 years. And basically we can read everything, we can know how people thought. Nothing was safe. All the data that we had collected at the NSA can now be read, and in other agencies around the world. And quantum computers will let you do that. And so we're developing new ways of doing quantum encryption. And one of the techniques we're looking at, my favorite is a friend that was at IBM, and Antigone and I were looking at using chaos theory and dynamical systems and fractal geometry to create kind of really interesting structures that cannot be broken with quantum computers, but uses a methodology for encryption.
Now, as I mentioned at the start, we just came from the World Economic Forum.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts on the event?
Oh, it's great. This was my first WEF, as they call it. And I met so many people that I knew and made all these great friends. I hung out a lot of different places, but one of the main ones was the Crypto HQ, where they put a lot of money in. But the reason they did that is all these companies are really looking for talent and people who understand blockchain technologies. Berkeley, of course, we're doing a lot of stuff in that, in the encryption, but it's really hard to find talent. There are not that many people. There are just a few hundred people who really understand the technology enough to build it out. And over time, as things grow, there'll be a lot more people who are able to do that. But the other real question is, what are we going to utilize all this technology for? And those ideas are expanding from, title companies and everybody having a unique identifier associated with them, and you get a degree, you tie it into that. So there's so much in the world of validation that's going to happen. Some of it's good, some of it's bad. If you have a disease, it'll always be on your record. The Chinese want to use methodology of that to basically rank their people, basically their entire population, and they're going to make decisions about who gets to do what based on that. So there's some good things and there's some bad things, and we have to be kind of careful on how do we utilize it. I think the authentication, whether to monitor medicine to see if it's authentic, in the world of consumer goods, you can see it's an authentic good that you're spending all that money for. Also, it will allow small contributions by a lot of people, so that it might build up an economy of knowledge too. So there's a lot of seen and I think many unforeseen things where this will be quite useful.
One of the original cornerstone philosophies behind Bitcoin was to take the power away from banks, corporations and governments and back into the hands of the people, and effectively bypassing the intermediaries that are currently necessary for financial transactions. So you can do a peer-to-peer, and it had huge ramifications for the potential disruption of the socio-economic system that we're accustomed to.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think there are governments that hate it. China, in particular, they are so into controlling currencies and their population, and you give people some freedom, and also in voting and democracy, there's all these things you can do with blockchain technology. And then with the cryptocurrencies, China really controls their assets. I think Maya, who created Alibaba, he said, I'm a billionaire, but I can't spend it. Basically, the Chinese government tells him how to keep his money. And then the Chinese government forces Yahoo to sell a large part of Alibaba. They disallow Facebook. And with this freedom, it's a whole economy that they cannot control. Now, in free markets in the US, hopefully is going to be wise enough to know that, okay, we don't have to control everything, but we want to make sure that consumers and that there's stability in the market, and we won't over-regulate, because if you do, it's all going to go to countries like Bermuda and Cayman Islands, and you have all this offshore accounts. And the liquidity issue is, you're going to be able to create economies outside of the scope of governments. And I should say about corporations, I think they're going to the banks are they're going to have to find a way to embrace some of it, and then corporations actually will utilize it in a way to be able to pay and distribute wealth in very interesting ways. I was up with my friends late at night who are very into this. I mean, they're very
blockchain savvy.
They're blockchain savvy, but they're actually some of the biggest. They're CEOs, presidents, and CTOs of major corporations, and they're trying to figure out ways to incorporate that into their game plan, into their economy. So I see a lot of potential, and we'll just see how it all works out.
I've been an investor in cryptocurrencies for over 4 years, and I'm starting to take my assets away from purely cryptocurrency or digital assets such as Bitcoin, Ethereum, towards utility tokens, where tokens are issued on a blockchain in an ICO, which has been proven to be far more efficient on every level than an IPO or traditional venture capitalism funding.
Well, it's interesting how this whole digital currency will play out. I think there's going to be a lot of things coming. I mean, one of the things that I said early on, kind of did some numbers and said, if they continue doing this, it's going to eat up a large part of the energy consumption of the world, and it's not going to be a good contribution. And right now, the cheapest place out of Iceland to mine these things are in China, and China wants to ban bitcoins for their population. So there's all these conflicts going on. Environmentally, I think it's a disaster. So we're going to have to come up with another way of creating currencies that have a value. And if there's ways to create a more stable currency, because right now a lot of the fluctuation in the currencies is because there are all these bots out there, and they do a lot of the trading, and it's an artificial market, and it's still small enough that these bots have a huge contribution. Yeah. If it gets to a point where it gets larger and there's more stability, and we know the limited number, I think that'll be good for the market. There are some things that frighten me, especially the unforeseen future. I mean, there's always the outlier that causes problems. Well, it was long-term capital management. And in that case, it wasn't that the algorithms were not good. They had everything hedged and everything. It's just distressed assets often become vastly undervalued. And so you'll see a lot of fluctuation of markets if some instabilities creep in.
Now, for one of the things I took away from World Economic Forum that was really touching was I met several Bitcoin millionaires, and there was even a Bitcoin billionaire that invested very early, and now they just travel the world finding charitable causes to donate to.
Well, that's interesting because I know as of last week, they're not Bitcoin billionaires anymore. They have, so you can kind of guess their value.
But they might
actually
be again
there's
tomorrow.
all 4 of them. I think lost their Bitcoin billionaire status.
Okay.
So you can guess how much money they have. It's a simple. Yeah. But and I remember going to the Winkle Brothers party with Kairos, and they, and Tim Draper and his group and everybody, they are putting a lot of resources in Bitcoins. But I think there's some truth to that. Bitcoins was the gold. And in the California gold rush, the people who made the money made the picks and shovels, and the Levi's. So Jacobs made pants out of tent canvas, and everybody bought them, and they're the ones that created the long-term generation of wealth. And I think that's going to be true with the financial institutions that manage the Bitcoins in a good way, so people feel comfortable. It's a liquid asset that can be used for transactions, and they provide stability in the market.
Now, going on to your other area of expertise, chaos theory. Now, you studied under Ralph Abraham, I believe.
Yeah, so Ralph was an amazing guy. He still is. So he was one of these non-conventional thinkers, and he was a mathematician at Berkeley, and he worked with Smale, who won the Fields Medal, and a lot of the young faculty of Berkeley and a few other institutions left to go to UC Santa Cruz, a young institution, and that's true of Santa Barbara too, and then they ended up getting all these Nobel Prize winners. And Ralph, he was just this way of, and he was really cool, and he was a way of thinking. And one of the great insights, how I got into the chaos group, so I was like the underling, so there was the four under Ralph, and then Ralph got me in because I wrote this thing on winning at blackjack, basically just recite what Jim Thorpe. I wrote a book called, and he said, how about applying your principles to roulette? And I said, there's no way you can win at roulette. The numbers are all there and everything. So I was just thinking about numbers. And one of the most insightful things he ever said, think about the physical system. And some of the chaos guys had figured out the speed of the wheel, the speed of the ball. They would toe tap the information in a shoe, and they could figure out which octant the ball would land on. So they had a 1 in 8 chance of getting a 1 in 35 payoff. That opened my whole world. It's like, okay, the physical system, we don't deal with just abstract numbers, we also deal with the physical system and how you find flaws in the system and weaknesses. And if the roulette wheel was tilted even 1 or 2%, you even had a higher insight. Well, then those guys did it, the computer in the shoe, they tried it, but they realized the real money was in figuring stability of markets. So then they created something called the predictors, and they would control a lot of Swiss banks' money, and they got pretty good returns.
Was that through computational algorithm?
Yeah, and I kind of know, when Farmer first gave this talk, I said, you can't predict the stock market and stuff. Well, chaos is not about prediction. It's about predicting things that can't happen, where instability is. So for instance, in the gaps in the rings of Saturn, there are all these big gaps. Well, there's places of instability. So most things follow Newtonian mechanics, but when the places they don't, and you can figure out why. Or with the water drop experiment, if you map basically the phase space, you'll see this kind of curve. So there's a drip. You won't be able to know when the next drip is, but you'll know that it can't be in these realms. And that's great insight. If you can reduce a lot of the uncertainty or where things can't be in instability realm, then you have a higher probability of predicting things. And that's one thing chaos was all about. And I got to be brought in that group almost serendipitously because I knew computers and all these new these mathematicians wanted to convert theory into computational models. And I remember reading a cover of Scientific American thinking it's really cool. A couple of weeks later, somebody says, oh, there's a mathematician who needs a programmer, you want to earn some extra money. And it was Piken who had the cover. And I learned later that when Scientific American came out, that week it shut down Silicon Valley because everybody was out programming the Mandelbrot set. And then Ralph Abraham had a set of books, and he said, why don't you have your software go with my books? And then the head of the physics department was going to teach a brand new class, probably the first class in chaos theory. And because I'd done all that stuff, he said, "You want me to be my TA?" And I was an undergraduate, and I remember the graduate girls in physics and astrophysics didn't pay a lot of attention to me. Some of them were even my TA, but when I became their TA for the chaos class, I got a lot of attention, and that was pretty cool. And my secret was just to understand everything one chapter ahead of everybody else.
Now, we had another discussion the other day about whether mathematics can really describe the full nature of reality and consciousness, and there's people that say, you know, God must be a mathematician, and you're evidently Christian, and how does that philosophy fit into your framework?
So it's very interesting. If you read Genesis, and in my opinion, so like there's things, one of the biggest things that always comes, well, time, it says this amount of time passed. Well, I think Einstein kind of proved there's no relativity in time. So the time issue was kind of resolved. And then the order of Genesis, if you look at how things were created, it's very similar to the way Stephen Hawking had basically generated time. I think there's one thing that's flipped, but everything else in the sequence. And Stephen Hawking was once that his equations got everything down to the size, something of the universe being the size of a grain of sand. Okay, that's close enough from creating the universe out of nothing. And I remember he was asked, and he said, "And what happened before that?" And his remark was, "And the rest is kind of conjecture." So, I mean, if you get the universe beginning to something the size of a grain of sand, I think you're doing pretty well. And so, you know, one of my friends who was a scientist said something very profound and wise. He says, "I believe God created the universe, and my job as a scientist is to figure out how." And there's a lot of really amazing people that are both Christians and scientists. One of my favorite and very close friend is Jennifer Weissman, and she helps run Hubble telescope. And Hubble created one of the most beautiful set of rays of beautiful images of the universe. And for her, there's no discrepancy. I mean, it basically, she understands her science, but the stuff that we don't understand, God creates in a way that, you know, we're not expected, we're humans. We don't expect to know everything. And I think we can go on for the rest of, for a very long time and just realize we just are learning more and more and more. It's like the Mandelbrot set. Yeah. You can just keep peering in forever and you still find this wonderful world of mathematics.
So reality is fractal.
Yeah, and I think of things in fractal dimensions. And it just happened, and I think it's a great asset in figuring out how to think differently. And I think fractal geometry caused a whole change in how we think. And I think a lot of things can, it's very important that we think in different methodologies. So my first software company with Ralph Abraham and Peter Van Roy and Michael Larson and all was basically we could generate with seeds all these wonderful plant structures so we could mimic nature mathematically. Well, I kind of know that there's a way, I'm pretty sure how the DNA transfers the mathematical information, and that's a journal article I really want to publish. It was like Alan Turing's work on the stripes of animals. He mathematically put out how these structures evolve, and it was a brilliant piece. In fact, that's one of my most favorite one of his because I thought it brought a new insight, whereas other stuff, it's like, yeah, you can figure this out. I mean, not to take anything away from Alan Turing, but this one was kind of exceptional in my view. It was a way to construct something that happened in nature.
You also mingle with a lot of the Silicon Valley crew.
Yeah, it's I grew up there, and my dad was really cool. He was a rocket scientist. He came to the U.S. because the U.S. government invited him over, and he was the first German to the South Pole, and he measured the Van Allen belt radiation. I think he was a chief scientist with Donald Douglas, but he wasn't that into computers. So I had to get another guy, and that was Doug Engelbart. The guy invented the mouse, the icon hypertext, first internet message, and he also became like my dad. And we'd hang around, and I was the kid that got to go to all these things. He would purposely drag me to these meetings of Silicon Valley elite and figure out what the future. I was technically known as the off-the-shelf technology guy, but in some ways I think he wanted somebody there that could pass it on to future generations. And that's part of my mission. And a lot of really great people, Woz thinks of, and the last thing that Steve Jobs ever did at Macworld, I went with Doug Engelbart, was to invite Doug and me to Apple. And he says, send me an email and I will show you around Apple and we'll do lunch. And Doug Engelbart was Steve Jobs' hero. And they had some conflict. Doug always wanted to make things so we could boost the common IQ. And Xerox PARC and Steve wanted to make simple things enough for secretaries or artists. And there was a healthy tension. And there were some stories with Steve showing Doug the Mac before it came out. And there was 2 comments that Doug made. He said, why do you only have 1 button on your mouse? Because the second mouse that Doug had built had 2 buttons. And also, where's an Ethernet port? And Steve goes, why would you need an Ethernet port? So Doug was always thinking 20 years ahead. And Doug had created all these ideas so the world could collaborate. And that was his mission. And I think it was a great mission. And I think that mission still needs to be fulfilled.
Can you possibly give outlook on the future from your perspective on how technology can enhance humanity and the planet as a whole and maybe help overcome certain issues?
Well, I'm excited, especially as it gives more power to people, individuals, and less power to governments and corporations. And I think and it helps the healthy tension. So corporations are good because they create products on a massive scale that everybody can afford. So that computer that we have in our hand, like the iPhone, that thing is a marvel of technology. But because we sell so many of them, we could offload the cost and research and provide it to all of humanity, well, much of humanity. So that's exciting. We're working on the world's most efficient solar cells, that we have the ones as light as paper. It's what's keeping NASA planes aloft. You can coat it on cars, and a day's worth of sunshine is worth an hour worth of driving. So now you don't have to, use all these dirty fuels. But one of the most amazing stuff is the brain stuff that we're doing. We're repairing your brain and knowing what you're seeing and hearing and thinking. And a lot of that is coming out of Berkeley. Now, there are other institutions that are doing a good job, and I'm a little Berkeley-centric because I taught there. But it's really amazing. We can look into your mind and knowing what you're seeing and hearing and thinking using a process of we show you things, we see the signatures in your brain, and then when we see that again, we know, okay, it's thinking something similar. We can image it. We can play Pink Floyd off your brain. It's just incredible. And as we create these machines that aren't these fMRI machines that are 7-ton, $3 million, but these 3-pound, $3,000 device, we can continually record what you're seeing, and we can refine that much as Google has done with language translation.
Mm-hmm. It seems inevitable to me that with the technology, it's like a technology arms race, and eventually in the future we might see robots being able to take over pretty much all human jobs, and it will create like a new superpower of people that have the best robots will become like a super duper elite. And
so there's the truth, and there's some things that we have to be cognizant of. China, so in the olden days, the US was like the real superpower, and then Russia was a superpower, but they were a superpower way behind in technology, especially in electronics. So the aeronautics stuff was pretty good. They got Sputnik in space before we did, but they lacked a lot of the IC and the engineering things. Today, China is really going to be a superpower that has to be dealt with. So China is really the superpower we have to worry about. They've broken in every corporate computer. They're working on quantum computing. They're doing a lot of the brain-machine interface stuff. And instead of liberties and freedoms expanding, they're being contracted. So they don't allow Facebook or Twitter. When I gave lectures there, I talked about Facebook and Twitter. They are limiting the knowledge of their citizens. They're trying to focus them as machines in some ways. They're ranking every citizen. And, it's great economically. They're doing very well. But from a humanistic standpoint, I don't think it's a good one. Also, it lacks a lot of creativity. India is the country that I think is emerging. I was just there for the Global Entrepreneurship Summit, and I like them. They have 29 official languages. People don't talk to, in different groups, don't talk to each other. But in some ways, they have really smart people. They'll learn to work together, and I think they'll make good allies. They make good players around the world. They're good team players. I think the U.S. was pretty good team players. The problem is China has learned not to be a good team player, and they've exploited a lot of our basically kindness. I don't want to say weakness, but and Trump in his speech yesterday basically said, look, countries have to look out for themselves, and we're going to work with our allies, but we're not going to let China eat our lunch. And they literally have. I mean, U.S. was such an economic powerhouse. It could be generous, especially to smaller countries. Today, with countries like China, that's not the case, because they just exploit those weaknesses. They don't allow Facebook, and they create their own system so they can build their own economy. And countries that offer the free trade, where anybody can put their things, then they're at a weakness because China can leverage their economy and then produce things in the other developing countries or our country where we can't have the reciprocal opportunity. And I'm talking Europe and America. So it's really, I think that's why he was well received at Davos. I mean, he's very controversial. I call him Twitter mouth and things like that. But I think on an economic sense, he really understands what business is all about. I also thought that providing an opportunity to bring all this wealth back to the U.S. for corporations. So the big examples, Apple's bringing in $350 billion. And the U.S. gets $38 billion of that in taxes or whatever. But the opportunity there is they can open up manufacturing plants in the U.S. They can basically provide a lot of technology and things. And it's not that Apple, there's a reason that Apple's doing that is China wants to control everything. And they've already made their mark in China. They've created a market. And they are beginning to feel the pressure of China's thumb on their facilities and their production and their control and access to information. The reason they don't want to provide keys or have a way to do it is they're not so afraid of the U.S., even though in some they're afraid of more stringent countries like China or Iran or things, and so they don't want to set a precedent. And I think Apple will do very well in bringing an internal ecosystem back to the U.S. that was basically there until the Japanese in the 80s started manufacturing chip processes and undercutting the U.S.
Now, I call me old-fashioned, and maybe this is a slightly morbid outlook, but I feel like humanity has probably progressed a little bit too far in technological achievements, and I think it's going to get worse before it gets better, but the state of the planet now is in trouble.
Well, environmentally, I think that's partially true.
And mental health as well.
Mental health, I think these robots that I envision Apple actually, or some other company, being able to make is going to be a great stride. They're going to work with older people. They're going to have more company. They're going to be able to create exoskeletons and people can walk. One of the biggest fears is people get older and they're going to fall and then they get atrophied. Well, if you put this exoskeleton in, they can still jog around. They'll just catch you when you fall. And I have a real positive outlook on, especially with elderly or with taking care of people. Now, the job thing is a very interesting thing. You're right, there's probably a lot of robots will take over a lot of jobs. What's happened in the past, humans seem to adapt. In the US, we have the lowest unemployment and everything in a long time. Eventually, robots will catch up and provide almost all manual labor or things. And then we have to provide a way that we can provide for our society on a level playing field, and then always have something that's upwardly mobile, where people can always strive to do better, to to make more money. Kind of in some ways the Singaporean model, where everybody gets a basic house, but if you want a bigger one, you have to trade your old one in and you get a bigger one and you keep moving up. And so we always offer upward mobility and opportunity, but also in some ways provide a safety environment for humanity. And maybe I'm really against it now because I want to encourage everybody to work. There's still a lot of opportunity. But there might come a day when we just say, look, everybody gets a base salary, and then if you want to make more, there's opportunities to do that.
And how about the issue of overpopulation? Do you think we need to, as Elon Musk is doing, he seems hell-bent on trying to colonize Mars, and in my view, it would be 1,000 times easier to sort out the problems on the planet, population and pollution, rather than terraforming Mars and transporting people there.
Well, I think what's interesting, well, I think as a race, we're explorers. Columbus came to America. The pioneering settlements didn't quite work, but we eventually got that system right. I think as economics gets better, people have less children, and then so I think there'll kind of be an equilibrium there. So I'm not, and the population growth has diminished a lot since the 60s, and also everybody's afraid we're going to starve, but we created food production methods through, everybody hates this genetic engineering. In the olden days, it was crossbreeding plants to more than double the yield of food, and that'll continue. I also think that we'll stop eating meat, and we'll create products that taste the same or that are because meat is one of the most inefficient production methods. It's also responsible for a lot of the global climate change if you believe it's the methane gas that creates it in CO2. But I also think with climate change, I'm more worried about climate pollution. One of the interesting things I learned with Ralph, back then it was nuclear winter. We're afraid they would have a nuclear war, and then everybody would freeze. So we can always control climate change by lobbing a few nuclear bombs into a volcano. It's extreme, but I'm just saying what I'm really concerned with. And also if you see these trends over time, we've always had these climate change. It goes up, and then it goes down, up, and we've seen these cycles all through
various ice ages.
Yeah, so we don't really understand what's going on. I think cutting pollution is a good idea for human health, but the other stuff we're still trying to get a grasp on it. And I know I get a lot of criticism, and it's okay. I'm now confident enough with my science and models that says, well, I still don't think we quite understand what's going on, and we shouldn't. We should be cautious of things, but we really should continue studying what's going on and look at different aspects of why things are happening. And climate change doesn't mean global warming. I think temperatures are getting warmer, that's a natural trend, but you also see all these different areas will find places of equilibrium. It's like a strange attractor in chaos theory. You have this kind of model set, and Lorentz actually created the first strange attractor to try to predict weather models. And he realized that the susceptibility to initial conditions could cause totally different results. So I think in some respect, there's certain areas of stability, and then eventually it just flips into another level of stability. In a few hundred years, we're going to have the poles change polarity, and we'll see what, these things just happen.
For no explainable reason.
Well, there are,
theories. Yeah. So my area of focus is natural sciences, health, genetics, biology. And how do you think technology can enhance our medical capacities to improve human health and well-being?
Well, I'm excited, and I'm sorry I'm Berkeley-centric, but we have this really cool thing called CRISPR, and we can genetically engineer. And I think CRISPR is very similar to writing programs.
Yeah.
And I think the first thing we'll do is try to engineer out things that are detrimental to human health. Genetic defects, potentially cancers, things. And then it'll be interesting when they start trying to make improvements. So,
but don't you think it gives people like a easy way out? I mean, I've got a few friends that smoke like 50 cigarettes a day, eat crap, and they're like, medicine will sort me out if I get fucked up in 10 years.
I think you should live a healthy lifestyle.
Yeah.
But one of the most fascinating talks I heard at Davos was on happiness and longevity. And it's like the most important thing you can do in your life is be happy and you'll live long. Don't try to do all these things. I hate smoking, don't get me wrong. You should be healthy, and but you should have a positive outlook and always have something that engages you mentally. And I think that is one of the key factors to living a long and healthy life. And that's the guy who did the article of Natural Geographic. So I'm just kind of, I also think that too, but he's the guy that actually proved it in the studies.
From my background in natural sciences, I observed that nature always seems to be one step ahead. Although we're catching up, I always see nature as being far superior than any human achievement.
Oh, biomimicry is amazing. We learn a lot from it. We've optimized turbine blades, we've done it. Just look at nature, how they do it. And they've had to optimize. And so
we see 100% energy efficiency in bacteria. Say, for example, luciferase, the bacteria that glow in the dark. They do it with 100% transfer of energy. And we haven't come anywhere close to 100% energy.
Yeah, so when you talk about that technology, something comes to mind. It's very interesting. So in Brazil, in Sao Paulo, they want to create all these street lights and infrastructure, and it's like a more than $1 billion contract. And the guys who were setting up this system, I said, they now have these fluorescent plants that MIT is creating, and you could just line the streets with that. You'd have natural light at night, and you wouldn't have to put any electrical infrastructure. You wouldn't have to worry about people stealing your power, maybe your trees, but so that's an interesting combination. And people are very apprehensive about GMOs, but I'll give you an example of a GMO that could save lots of lives. Now, potato chips are really bad for you, so I don't advocate anybody eating potato chips, even though I do. But if you can genetically modify one gene in a potato, you have 1/4 the chance of getting cancer from the potato chip. And there's an example of GMOs saving people's lives.
Wow, I was not aware of that at all. Fascinating.
Yeah, so there are, yeah.
Okay, so I think we'll leave it at that. Thank you so much.
Oh, it's a real pleasure.
And
I wish you all the best in your...
I really look forward to reading your book, Linear Fractals.
Well, type in linear fractals into Google and you'll come up with my book, and I'll be number one.
Okay.
And hopefully, and if you type in BMI, I think Berkeley will be number one.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of really great universities around the world, but I still say go Bears and go Slugs. And, yeah.
Thank you, Ben.
Sure.